My husband died and left me only a note. Forgive me. I was not honest with you. At his funeral, a stranger approached me. He asked me to give you this personally. Inside was a key and an address. When I arrived, my life changed forever. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say that the signs were there all along. They say you just have to look. What they don't tell you is how invisible those signs are when you're living inside a life you trust completely. My name is Claire Morrison. I was 42 years old when my husband Daniel died, and I want to tell you what happened, all of it, because I spent a long time staying quiet, and silence nearly cost me everything. Daniel and I met in Portland, Oregon at a small dinner party hosted by mutual friends. He was charming in a quiet way, not flashy, not loud. He asked me careful questions and listened to the answers. That was 2003. We married in 2005 in a garden ceremony in the Columbia River Gorge. 20 guests, no fuss. For 18 years, I thought I understood exactly who Daniel Morrison was. He worked in commercial real estate investment. I had spent a decade as an accountant before I left to teach high school math. We lived in a modest craftsman house in southeast Portland, drove sensible cars, took one vacation a year. We had no children, not by choice exactly, but by the quiet accumulation of time passing. We were comfortable. We were steady. I loved him. Was there happiness? Yes. Real happiness. The kind that lives in ordinary moments. Sunday mornings with coffee and the newspaper, evening walks along the river, the particular way he laughed when something surprised him. I did not spend 18 years pretending. I spent 18 years believing. And then, things shifted. Slowly. The way weather changes before a storm. Barely perceptible. Until you notice you're cold. It started about 2 years before his death. Daniel began working longer hours. That alone meant nothing. Commercial real estate is cyclical, and I'd seen busy periods before. But this was different. He came home distracted in a way he had never been. Present physically, absent in every way that mattered. I'd ask about his day, and he'd give me a sentence where once he'd given me a conversation. His phone changed, too. He'd always left it on the kitchen counter. Suddenly, it traveled with him from room to room, screen down. I noticed. I told myself I was being paranoid. There were 2 weekend trips he described as conferences, one in Seattle, one in San Francisco. I had no reason to question them. I didn't question them. But something small and persistent lodged itself in the back of my mind, the way a splinter does before you know it's infected. 6 months before he died, I found a receipt in his jacket pocket. A restaurant in the Pearl District. Dinner for 2, a bottle of wine I recognized as expensive. A Tuesday night when he'd told me he was working late. I held that receipt for a long time in our laundry room, standing next to the dryer. I turned it over. I put it in my pocket. I did not confront him. Why didn't I confront him? I've asked myself that question more times than I can count. The honest answer is that I was afraid of what the confrontation would open. Some doors, once you knock, cannot be closed again. He became quieter over those final months. Not cruel. Daniel was never cruel, but quieter. There were evenings where I caught him staring at nothing, a kind of haunted stillness in his eyes that I chalked up to stress. I suggested therapy. He said he'd think about it. He never made an appointment. The last night I saw him alive, he made dinner. Pasta from scratch, which he hadn't done in years. He poured wine. He asked me about my students, specifically about a boy named Marcus I'd been worried about, a quiet kid who was falling behind. Daniel listened. He really listened the way he used to. At the end of the evening, he held me in the kitchen for a long time without speaking. I thought it meant he was coming back to me. I thought the distance was ending. The next morning, I woke up and he was already gone. He left for work early sometimes. I made coffee, showered, drove to school. I taught 3 periods. At 11:47 in the morning, my phone rang. It was Daniel's business partner, Greg Hartwell. His voice was flat and strange. "Claire," he said, "there's been an accident." Daniel had driven to a parking structure downtown. He'd been found in his car. The medical examiner would later rule it a suicide. I don't remember the drive to the hospital. I remember the fluorescent lights of a waiting room. I remember a doctor whose name I immediately forgot. I remember someone handing me a plastic bag with Daniel's belongings, his wallet, his watch, his phone with a cracked screen, and I remember the note, a single folded piece of paper from his inside jacket pocket, written in his careful, familiar handwriting. "Forgive me. I wasn't honest with you." 7 words. 18 years. And 7 words. I stood in that hospital hallway and read them 6 times. Then I folded the paper, put it in my pocket, and I walked out into the Portland rain, which was falling the way it always did. Steady, indifferent, relentless. The week between Daniel's death and his funeral is something I can only describe in fragments. There is a particular grief that comes not just from losing a person, but from losing the story you believed your life was. That week, I was grieving both simultaneously, and the 2 kinds of pain twisted around each other in a way I couldn't separate. Our finances, I discovered quickly, were not what I had thought. I sat down at the kitchen table the second night with a legal pad and Daniel's filing cabinet unlocked beside me. What I found, or rather, what I didn't find, made my chest tighten. Our joint checking account had roughly $4,000 in it. Our savings account, which should have held close to $60,000, had been drawn down to $800. The investment accounts I knew about showed minimal balances. Daniel had earned good money. We had spent modestly. Where had it gone? I searched for recent statements. I found almost nothing. The filing cabinet that had always held organized folders was strangely thin, as though someone had been slowly removing documents over time. I told myself there must be explanations, online statements I hadn't seen, accounts I wasn't aware of, investment vehicles that would become clear in the weeks ahead. I hired a probate attorney named Linda Park, a small, precise woman who had been recommended by a colleague. She reviewed what I had and looked at me carefully. "Do you know the full scope of your husband's business holdings?" she asked. "He was a partner in a commercial real estate investment firm," I said. "Hartwell Morrison Investments. Greg and Rachel Hartwell are the other partners." She wrote that down. "Did you have visibility into the firm's financials?" "No," I admitted. "Daniel handled that side of things." She said she would begin pulling records. She said the process would take time. What she didn't say, but what I heard in the pause before she spoke again, was that this could be complicated. I want to tell you about the funeral, because that is where everything changed. It was held at a small chapel on the east side of Portland on a gray Thursday morning. About 60 people came. Colleagues, neighbors, a few old friends from Daniel's college years, people from the running club he'd belonged to. Greg and Rachel Hartwell sat in the second row. Rachel was beautifully composed in black, her posture perfect, her eyes dry. Greg held her hand. They both nodded at me when I arrived, those careful, rehearsed nods of condolence, and I nodded back because I didn't know yet what I know now. The service was short. I said a few words. I did not cry until I sat back down, and then I cried quietly and did not stop for a long time. Afterward, in the reception line outside, a man approached me whom I didn't recognize. He was perhaps 55, compact with close-cropped gray hair, and the look of someone who had spent a long time being careful about things. He waited until the other guests had moved away. "Mrs. Morrison," he said quietly. "My name is Marcus Webb." I knew Daniel, not from Portland, from before. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," I said automatically. He glanced around us, a gesture so subtle I almost missed it. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a small envelope. Standard size, white, sealed. He held it in both hands. "Daniel asked me to give you this," he said. "If anything ever happened to him," he was very specific, "in person directly to you, no one else." I looked at the envelope. I looked at him. "When did he ask you that?" "About 6 weeks ago." 6 weeks ago. 2 weeks before that last dinner he'd cooked for me. "Who are you?" I said. "How do you know Daniel?" "We were friends a long time ago, college. We stayed in touch, loosely. He called me out of the blue in October and asked me to do this one thing." He paused. "I think he trusted me because I'm not connected to anyone in his current life." I took the envelope. My hands were steady, which surprised me. Inside were 2 things: a small silver key, the kind that opens a padlock, and a handwritten card with an address in the Pearl District of Portland and the words, "Storage Unit 114. Everything is there. I'm sorry I waited too long. I drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. What was in that storage unit? Why hadn't he just told me? Why hadn't he left this note instead of the one he left? Why had he chosen a man I'd never met to deliver it? The question spiraled, and beneath the grief, beneath the shock, beneath the numbness that had been my constant companion for a week, something else ignited, something quiet and cold and purposeful. I made a decision that night, not dramatically, not with anger exactly. I sat at the kitchen table where I'd eaten breakfast with Daniel for 15 years, and I said out loud to the empty room, "I am going to find out what he hid, and I am going to handle it." I put the key in my pocket. I called Linda Park and left a message asking for an urgent meeting. I did not call Greg Hartwell, though he had texted 3 times asking how I was doing and whether I needed anything. That kindness, I was beginning to understand, might not be kindness at all. I met with Linda Park the following Monday morning. Her office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, and from her window I could see the gray ribbon of the Willamette River. I set the envelope on her desk, the key, the card, everything, and I told her about Marcus Webb. She listened without interrupting. That was what I liked about Linda. She didn't fill silences with reassurance. "Before you go to that address," she said, "I want to know more about Hartwell Morrison Investments." What she had found in the 4 days since our first meeting was already alarming. The firm had been established in 2015, incorporated in Delaware, with Daniel and Greg Hartwell as equal partners and Rachel Hartwell as a director. In the past 3 years, the firm had acquired multiple commercial properties in Portland and the surrounding metro area. The total portfolio value based on public records and assessed value was estimated at somewhere between $8 and $12 million. I made her repeat that, $8 to $12 million. "That's the firm," I said carefully. "Daniel's share would be half." "In theory," Linda said, "but that depends on the operating agreement and what that agreement says about a partner's death and whether any of Daniel's interest had been transferred, sold, or otherwise restructured before his death. Can that happen without my knowledge? She looked at me steadily. In Oregon, business assets held in a partner's name are not automatically marital property in the same way a jointly held bank account is. Depending on how the firm was structured, Daniel could have made significant changes to his interest without your consent. The word consent landed in the room and stayed there. When did those changes happen? I asked. That, she said, is what I'm trying to determine. But I'll tell you this. The firm's registered agent filed several amendments to the operating agreement in the past 14 months. I'm requesting those documents. I drove to the storage facility that afternoon. It was located in a quiet block near the river, a climate-controlled building, the kind of anonymous place designed to hold the things people don't want seen. I gave the code at the gate. Daniel had written it on the back of the card, and I found Unit 114 at the end of a long corridor lit by fluorescent strip lights. The key fit. The padlock clicked open. Inside was a space the size of a large closet, and it was organized with the same methodical care Daniel had applied to everything in his life. Metal shelving units held labeled banker's boxes. A fireproof safe sat on the floor. A laptop in a padded case rested on the top shelf. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Was I ready? Was anyone ever ready for the moment their entire understanding of their own life bifurcated? I took the first box. Over the next 4 hours, sitting on the concrete floor of that storage unit with the fluorescent light humming above me, I read through the history of a life I hadn't known existed. Daniel had kept meticulous records, bank statements, legal documents, correspondence, printed emails. What emerged from those boxes was a picture drawn in slow, terrible detail. In 2019, Rachel Hartwell had begun a personal relationship with Daniel. The correspondence made that clear. Emails between them, careful and then less careful, professional and then not. By 2020, Rachel had been working with Greg, her own husband, and with their attorney to systematically restructure the firm in a way that diminished Daniel's equity position. Daniel, it seemed, had gone along with it at first. Guilt, perhaps. Fear of exposure. The particular paralysis that comes from being caught between two lives. But something had changed. In the past 6 months, Daniel had begun documenting everything. The emails he'd printed, the agreements he'd flagged with sticky notes, a handwritten timeline that covered 8 pages. At the bottom of the third box, I found a letter addressed to me, not folded into a pocket this time, sealed in an envelope labeled "For Claire" in his handwriting. I opened it sitting on that cold floor. He wrote that he had made terrible choices, that Rachel had approached him, and that he had been weak, that he had not known at first what she and Greg were doing to the firm's structure, and that by the time he understood, he was too compromised to feel he had the right to fight back, that he had spent the last 6 months trying to find a way to protect me without having to confess, that he had failed, that he loved me, and that he was ashamed. He wrote that everything in the storage unit was documentation of what the Hartwells had done, that with the right attorney, I could potentially recover his rightful equity share. He wrote, "I know I am leaving you to fight alone. That is the worst thing I've ever done. I'm sorry." I folded the letter. I sat with it in my hands for a long time. Then I called Linda Park. "I found what I need," I said. My voice was remarkably even. "I have financial records, correspondence, and a documented timeline going back 6 years. The Hartwells have been systematically defrauding Daniel of his equity position in the firm. I have it all." A pause. "Claire," Linda said. "This is a significant finding." "I know. Once we begin formal proceedings, they will know immediately." "Good," I said, and I meant it. Linda filed the initial claim on a Wednesday. By Friday morning, Greg Hartwell had called me 4 times. I let them all go to voicemail. The messages progressed in tone from sympathetic to strained to something that was not quite threatening but was adjacent to it. The 4th message said, "Claire, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Rachel and I, we want to talk to you. We want to help. Please call me back." I listened to it twice, then forwarded it to Linda. The formal action was a civil suit seeking accounting and recovery of Daniel's rightful equity interest in Hartwell Morrison Investments, based on the documented restructuring of the partnership in 2020 to 2022 that had been executed without proper consideration or Daniel's fully informed consent. Linda had also referred the financial documentation to the Oregon Division of Financial Regulation, flagging potential securities violations in how investors had been characterized in amended filings. The Hartwells hired a firm within 48 hours, a large one, downtown Portland, 2 names on the letterhead, the kind of firm that advertises in legal journals. Their opening correspondence was formal and dismissive. The amendments to the operating agreement had been lawfully executed. Daniel had signed all relevant documents. Any suggestion of fraud was defamatory, and they reserved all rights. Linda read the letter at our next meeting and set it down calmly. "They're worried," she said. "Good," I said again. That word was becoming something of a refrain. I had moved the banker's boxes from the storage unit to Linda's office. Copies had been made, originals secured. The laptop, which Daniel had kept in that unit, had been forensically imaged by a specialist Linda recommended. The emails between Rachel and Daniel were on it, along with financial modeling documents that showed, in Daniel's own careful spreadsheets, the pre- and post-restructuring value of his equity position. The difference was approximately $4 million. $4 million that had been maneuvered away from him over 4 years. The escalation came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at home, grading papers at the kitchen table. I had gone back to teaching because routine was the only thing keeping me functional, when Rachel Hartwell appeared at my front door. I saw her through the glass panel beside the door before she knocked. I stood in the hallway and looked at her for a moment. Then I opened the door. She was composed, as always. Cashmere coat, blonde hair, the careful pleasantness of a woman who had spent years managing impressions. "I think we should talk," she said. "Just the 2 of us." "My attorney has advised me not to speak with you directly," I said. It wasn't quite true. Linda had said to be careful, not forbidden contact, but it was accurate enough. "Claire." Her voice softened. "What you think happened, it's not what happened. Daniel was struggling. He made decisions. We tried to accommodate him. We documented everything because we had to protect the firm's investors. This lawsuit is going to hurt everyone, including you." "I appreciate the concern," I said. My own voice surprised me, measured, almost cool. "You can reach my attorney." Something shifted in her expression. Not anger exactly, calculation. "Daniel signed those documents willingly," she said. "Whatever story you've built in your head, the paperwork tells a different one. You're going to spend a lot of money and come out with nothing." "Then you have nothing to worry about," I said, and I closed the door. My hands shook for about 10 minutes after that. I sat down at the kitchen table and pressed both palms flat on the surface and breathed. But here is what I noticed. The shaking wasn't fear exactly, or it was fear and something else together. The particular feeling of a person who has decided to stand in a place and not be moved. I was afraid the way you're afraid when you're doing something that matters, not the fear that stops you, the fear that proves you're serious. 3 days later, Greg Hartwell's attorneys sent a letter that crossed several lines Linda described as aggressive. It included veiled language about Daniel's mental state, suggestions that his documentation was the product of a troubled mind in his final weeks, and an implication that pursuing the lawsuit would require us to submit Daniel's personal correspondence and psychiatric history to discovery. A threat designed, I understood immediately, to make me fear having Daniel's suicide and his affair exposed publicly. I read that letter twice. Then I called Linda. "They're trying to intimidate you," she said. "This is a pressure tactic." "I know," I said. "Let's keep going." After I hung up, I let myself take 3 days, not to retreat, to recover. I drove to the coast to a rental cabin near Cannon Beach that Sarah, my best friend since college, had used the previous summer. I sat on the deck in a heavy sweater and watched the Pacific move. I slept 8 hours 2 nights in a row. I did not think about Rachel Hartwell's composure or Greg Hartwell's lawyers or $4 million. I thought about the ocean, which has been indifferent to human drama for considerably longer than I have. I came back to Portland on Sunday evening. I was ready. The call came on a Wednesday evening, 9 days after I returned from the coast. Greg Hartwell himself this time, not through attorneys, not through Rachel. His voice was different from the messages he'd left in those early weeks, quieter, almost gentle. "Claire, I know you don't want to hear from me," he said, "and I understand why. But I'm asking you to listen for 2 minutes, not as an opponent, as someone who knew Daniel." I was standing in my kitchen, and I made myself be still. "All right," I said. "Whatever Rachel and Daniel's, whatever happened between them personally, that was not something I sanctioned or encouraged. I've been trying to hold this firm together through an incredibly painful situation. The restructuring you're focused on was about protecting investors, not about hurting Daniel, not about hurting you." "I see," I said. "We want to make an offer," he said. "Informal, not through attorneys. A settlement, structured in a way that gets you a meaningful payment without years of litigation and without the personal details of Daniel's life becoming a public record." There it was. That was the shape of the offer. Money in exchange for silence, in exchange for the affair and the suicide staying private, in exchange for me going away. I thought about Daniel's letter, written on the floor of that storage unit. "I know I am leaving you to fight alone." "Thank you for calling, Greg," I said. "Send any formal offers through Linda Park." "Claire, I'm trying to help you." "Then help me through my attorney," I said. "Good night." I hung up and stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen. Was I tempted? I want to be honest. There was a part of me, small, tired, bruised, that heard the word settlement and felt the pull of it. An end. The particular appeal of putting something awful behind you instead of walking through the middle of it. Was that weakness? I don't think so. I think that's just being human. But I also knew exactly what that settlement would cost me. The truth. And I had been living without the truth for long enough. I called Sarah that evening. Sarah Chen and I had been friends since our sophomore year at the University of Oregon. She was a family law attorney in Eugene, and she had the quality I find rarest in people. She did not tell you what to feel. She listened, and then she said what she actually thought. I told her about Greg's call, about the offer, about the temptation I'd felt and dismissed. "Good," she said immediately. "They're scared. People who hold a winning hand don't call you directly at 7 in the evening to have a personal conversation. He mentioned Daniel's affair, the public record. Of course he did. That's the only card they have against you emotionally. Claire, that information comes out in discovery whether you settle or not, if they choose to use it. Settling doesn't actually protect you from that. It just makes it cheaper for them. They're bluffing. I'd known that, I realized. Somewhere under the tiredness, I'd known it. Hearing Sarah say it clearly was like having a window opened in a stuffy room. I need you to come up to Portland, I said. Not professionally, just, I need a friend. I'll be there Saturday, she said, without hesitation. She stayed for a long weekend. We walked along the river. We cooked dinner together and drank decent wine. We talked about Daniel, the real Daniel, the complicated one, the man I had loved and the man who had failed me. And Sarah did not make it simple or tidy. She sat with me in the mess of it. That is what real friendship is, I think. Not the people who help you feel better, but the people who stay when better isn't available yet. On Sunday afternoon, I also heard from Marcus Webb for the first time since the funeral. He sent a brief email. I've been following the news. I want you to know that I'm willing to testify if it comes to that. Daniel talked to me in those last weeks. I know what was weighing on him. I know what he believed had been done to him. You shouldn't have to fight this with only paperwork. I read it twice. Then I wrote back, "Thank you. That may matter more than you know. I had the documents. I had Linda. I had Sarah. I had Marcus Webb, who had known Daniel before any of this, and who was willing to stand up and say so. What did the Hartwells have? Money, lawyers, and the assumption that I would break. They had never met me. Not really. They came to my house on a Saturday morning in February, both of them this time, Greg and Rachel Hartwell together, unannounced, standing on my porch at 10 o'clock in the morning as though they were neighbors stopping by. Greg was in a sport coat and an open collar, aiming for casual. Rachel had softened her presentation. No cashmere, a simple wool sweater, her hair down. They looked, I thought, like people who had rehearsed this. I saw them from the upstairs window before I went down. I stood there for a moment and made a deliberate choice. I opened the door. We were in the neighborhood, Greg began, which was transparently false. They lived in Lake Oswego, 20 minutes south. We just thought, Rachel wanted to say something, to you directly. I looked at Rachel. "Can we come in?" she said. Her voice had something new in it, a rougher edge beneath the smoothness, like something worn thin. "Please, just for a few minutes." I considered it. I let them in. We sat in the living room. I did not offer coffee. I sat in the armchair across from the couch where they placed themselves side by side, and I waited. Rachel spoke first. She said she understood I was angry. She said she understood why. She said that what had happened between her and Daniel had been brief, and that she had broken it off herself, which I noted was different from anything Daniel had written, and that she had spent a long time feeling terrible about it. She said that the firm's restructuring had been mischaracterized in the documents I'd found, that Daniel had been in agreement at the time, and that if I looked at the full context, I would understand that what I believed was fraud was actually a legitimate adjustment made during a difficult transitional period for the business. Then her tone shifted, almost imperceptibly, but I caught it. "We care about what happens to you," she said. "We genuinely do, and we're worried that you're being guided toward a fight that's going to be very damaging for Daniel's reputation, for yours. Your attorney is pushing you toward litigation because that's how attorneys get paid, but you're the one who has to live with what comes out. You're the one whose name goes in the newspaper." Greg leaned forward. "There's still a number that works for everyone," he said. "Not what we offered before. Better. We want to be fair to you, Claire. We don't want to be enemies." I sat with it for a moment. I let the silence be. Was this the version of them that was sorry? Or was this the version of them that was afraid? I looked at Rachel Hartwell, at her careful body language, her practiced sincerity, the way her hands were folded in her lap like someone in a performance, and I understood with a clarity that was almost physical that she had never stopped calculating. She had calculated when she approached Daniel. She had calculated through 4 years of quietly restructuring the firm. She was calculating now in my living room with her husband beside her, wearing a soft sweater. "I appreciate you coming," I said. "I want to be honest with you because I think you deserve honesty." They both looked at me. "I've read Daniel's documentation extensively," I said. "I've read the correspondence, the spreadsheets, the timeline he kept. I've read his letter to me. I understand exactly what happened, and I understand why it happened, and I am not going to stop the lawsuit, not for a settlement that protects you from accountability, not to keep Daniel's affair out of the public record, because frankly, that's your scandal more than mine, and not because you've driven over here on a Saturday to sit on my couch and tell me you care about me." The room was very quiet. Rachel's expression changed. The softness left it like a light going out. What remained was something harder, something older. "You're making a mistake," she said. Her voice had dropped, the performance stripped away. "We have resources you don't. We have attorneys who do this for a living. You have a grief-stricken widow with a dead man's files and a small-town lawyer. You know how this ends." "I know how it ends," I agreed calmly. "That's why I'm not afraid of it." Greg stood. Rachel stood. The atmosphere in the room had changed completely. "We tried," Greg said, mostly to himself. "You did," I said. "I'll show you out." I closed the door behind them and stood in my hallway, alone. My heart was beating faster than I had let them see. Was I scared? Yes. In the way you're scared when you've stepped off a ledge and committed to the fall. But the fear was clean. It had edges. It was the kind of fear that comes from choosing something real over something safe. I called Linda first. "They came to your house?" She was quiet for a moment. "That tells me something." "What does it tell you?" "That our forensic accountant's preliminary report scared them more than they're showing. We received a copy of their initial discovery response this morning. There are irregularities in how they've characterized the 2021 amendment. I think we're closer than they want you to believe." I exhaled slowly. "Then let's keep going." The deposition was scheduled for a Thursday in March in a conference room on the 11th floor of Linda's office building. Portland was doing what Portland does in March, raining steadily, the air carrying the particular cold that gets into your coat, no matter how thick it is. The Hartwells arrived with 2 attorneys. 4 of them arranged themselves on one side of the long table. Linda and I sat on the other, along with our forensic accountant, a precise woman named Dr. Elaine Cho, who had spent 6 weeks with Daniel's documentation and the firm's financial records obtained through discovery. Rachel was deposed first. Greg sat in the waiting room. Rachel Hartwell had been deposited before, I could tell. She answered questions in the measured way of someone who had rehearsed, careful, technical, never elaborating beyond what was asked. Her attorneys objected often, which told me something. People object when they're close to something they don't want exposed. Linda worked methodically through the 2020 and 2021 amendments to the operating agreement, asking Rachel to explain each provision. The amendments had reduced Daniel's equity position by 31% through a series of adjustments tied to a performance metric clause that had been inserted without any corresponding baseline documentation. "Who drafted the performance metric clause?" Linda asked. "Our firm's outside counsel," Rachel said. "Which attorney specifically?" A pause. "I believe it was handled by the team." "Are you aware that in discovery, we obtained billing records from your outside counsel, and that those records show the performance metric clause was first drafted as a memo sent to you personally, not to Daniel, 3 weeks before it appeared in the amended agreement?" Another pause. Rachel's attorney leaned toward her. "I'm not sure I recall the specific sequence," Rachel said. "Let me show you Exhibit 31, Linda said. Exhibit 31 was a printed email from Rachel to the outside counsel, dated March 3, 2021. In it, Rachel discussed the performance metrics in careful, knowledgeable language, proposing specific thresholds, discussing how they would affect Daniel's equity calculation, using phrasing that made clear she fully understood the mechanism. Beneath it was the counsel's reply, and beneath that a draft clause that matched the final version, almost word for word. Rachel looked at the document. Her attorney was very still. "Does this refresh your recollection?" Linda asked. "I'd need to review it more carefully," Rachel said. Her voice was controlled, but something had tightened in it. "Let's look at Exhibit 32, Linda said. "This is the original operating agreement from 2015, signed by you, Greg, and Daniel. Could you point me to the section that authorizes equity adjustments based on individual partner performance metrics?" Rachel looked. She turned pages. She turned them back. There was no such section, because no such section existed. The 2015 agreement had no provision for what had been done to Daniel's equity. The amendments had not modified an existing mechanism. They had invented one. Dr. Cho's testimony, which came later that morning, was methodical and devastating. She walked through 6 years of financial records with the calm of a scientist, presenting findings she had verified 3 times. The equity restructuring had transferred approximately $4,200,000 in value from Daniel's position to the firm's general pool, a pool in which the Hartwells held majority control. The process had been executed over 4 amendments, each small enough to seem routine, collectively large enough to constitute what Dr. Cho described, without apparent emotion, as a systematic diminishment of a partner's equity through manufactured contractual mechanisms. She used the word manufactured twice. Linda let it sit both times. Greg Hartwell's deposition was in the afternoon. He came in looking different from the man who had sat on my couch in February, less polished, something fraying at the edges. His attorneys had clearly been managing him because his answers were careful to the point of being incoherent. When Linda showed him the same email chain, his response, that he hadn't been involved in drafting the clause, contradicted Rachel's earlier statement that it had been a team effort. Linda noted the contradiction aloud. One of his attorneys objected. The contradiction remained. I sat across the table and watched. I had made myself a promise when I walked into that room. I would not perform. I would not let them see anger or triumph or distress. I would be a person who had done her work and knew it. At 3:45 in the afternoon, a recess was called. One of the Hartwells' attorneys approached Linda outside the conference room. "Our clients would like to discuss a resolution," he said. Linda looked at me. I gave a small nod. "We're listening," Linda said, "but our client is no longer interested in any figure that doesn't reflect the full documented diminishment, plus costs." The attorney was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant number." It's the accurate number, Linda said. I drove home through the Portland rain that evening. The streetlights were reflected in the wet asphalt. I sat at a red light on Burnside and let myself feel it. Not triumph, not quite. Something quieter. The feeling of having stood where I said I would stand. I thought about Daniel, sitting in a parking structure, writing 7 words. I thought about how different it might have been if he had turned the car around, if he had come home that evening and told me everything. We might have fought. I might have left, or I might not have. But we would have been dealing with the truth, and that, even painful truth, is something you can work with. I had no anger left for him that evening, only something that felt strangely like sorrow and forgiveness arriving together, neither one canceling the other out. The settlement conference was held 6 weeks later, on an April morning when Portland had briefly remembered that spring was possible. There was actual sunlight. I noticed it through the conference room window and thought that Daniel would have pointed it out. He'd always loved the rare, bright days. I want to be precise about what happened, because precision matters. Hartwell Morrison Investments settled for $4,150,000, the full documented diminishment of Daniel's equity, rounded to reflect legal costs. The settlement included the following non-negotiable terms, each of which Linda and I had written into the framework weeks earlier and held to without movement. Full payment within 60 days, secured by a deed of trust on 2 of the firm's commercial properties in the event of non-payment. A written acknowledgement, not public but legally binding, that the 2020 and 2021 amendments to the operating agreement had been executed without Daniel's fully informed understanding of their financial impact. They did not use the word fraud. Linda told me that was fine. The acknowledgement was what mattered. No non-disclosure agreement. I was not required to stay silent. I was not required to protect their reputation as the price of receiving what Daniel was owed. Rachel Hartwell did not look at me when the documents were signed. She sat across the table with her attorney and signed where she was directed and looked at the wall. Greg signed with the heavy deliberateness of a man doing something he had hoped to avoid until the last possible moment. The Oregon Division of Financial Regulation's separate inquiry, the one Linda had initiated when I first brought the documentation to her, remained open. That was a matter outside my control and the settlement, and the Hartwell's attorneys had fought hard to make the settlement contingent on my withdrawing the referral. I had refused. The regulatory inquiry was not mine to withdraw. That had been one of the 2 moments in the entire process when Rachel had looked at me directly, and I had held her gaze until she looked away. After the signing, Linda and I walked to a coffee shop 2 blocks from her office. She ordered tea. I ordered coffee. We sat by the window and didn't speak for a moment. "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said. He had all of it documented. Every email, every amendment, every number. He knew exactly what they'd done. He just didn't believe he had the right to fight back. "Because of the affair," Linda said. "Because of the guilt," I said. "He thought he'd forfeited the right to be wronged." Linda turned her cup slowly on the table. "A lot of people feel that way," she said. "It's one of the most effective tools manipulators use. Make someone feel complicit enough that they lose the language for their own grievance." I thought about that for a long time afterward, about how Rachel had understood Daniel's guilt and used it, about how precisely she had read him, and how that kind of reading, cold, strategic, in the service of extraction, is its own form of violence. Marcus Webb came to Portland in May. We had coffee, and he told me about the Daniel he had known in college, young, serious, genuinely kind, and I found that I could hold that person alongside the person who had failed me without one canceling the other. People are not one thing. I had learned that thoroughly. What they owe you, regardless of their complexity, is honesty. What they owe themselves is the same. I remained in the house for the first year. Then I made a decision. I sold it. Not dramatically, not out of pain, but practically. A house with that much of my life in the walls was not something I wanted to maintain alone. I bought a smaller place in the Selwood neighborhood, closer to the river, with a back garden that I had plans for. My attorney's fees came to roughly $80,000. I paid them without bitterness. They were among the best $80,000 I have ever spent. Because what Linda Park did was not just win a case. She helped me understand what fighting for something legitimate actually looked like. The remaining money went into a trust structure Sarah helped me design. Some invested conservatively. Some set aside for the future I was going to build. A portion, a meaningful one, donated to a nonprofit that provides legal aid to surviving spouses navigating financial disputes after the death of a partner. There are more of us than people know. The regulatory inquiry into Hartwell Morrison Investments resulted 14 months after I initiated it in a formal finding of disclosure violations in how the firm had represented its ownership structure to certain institutional investors. The Hartwells were ordered to pay civil penalties and required to engage an independent compliance officer for 3 years. The finding was public. I read it on a Tuesday morning sitting in my new kitchen with coffee, and I thought, Daniel kept every receipt because he knew it would matter. He left me the key because he couldn't face it himself, but he wanted me to be able to. It wasn't the version of events I would have written, but it was the truth. And I had learned, by then, that truth is worth more than a comfortable story, even when it costs more to hold. I want to tell you who I am now, 2 years after that conference room in April. I still teach. I didn't expect that. In the months after Daniel died, I had imagined I might leave Portland entirely, move somewhere no one knew the story, start over in the cleanest possible sense. But when I tried to picture it, I found I didn't want it. My students are here. My river is here. Sarah drives up twice a month. This city, difficult as it has been for me, is where I became myself again, and you don't leave that. My garden is improbably successful for someone who had never gardened before. Tomatoes, herbs, a climbing rose that took over the back fence in its first full summer. I spend weekend mornings out there in a way that surprises me with its peace. I started running. 3 mornings a week in all weather along the river path. There's a man named Philip who runs the same route at the same time, a high school history teacher at a school 3 blocks from mine. We began nodding, then talking. He is careful and kind and asks questions the way I remember someone once asking questions, and listens to the answers. I'm not rushing anything, but I notice it. I notice him. Marcus Webb sent me a photograph at Christmas, a group shot from a college camping trip. Daniel at 22, squinting into the sun, laughing at something outside the frame. I have it on my mantelpiece. It is the Daniel I try to remember when I think about him at all. Young, before the choices, before the fear. Now, the Hartwells. The settlement paid out in full on day 59. 1 day before the deed of trust would have been enforced. That tells you something about where they were financially. The regulatory finding changed things significantly. 2 institutional investors withdrew from ongoing projects, citing compliance concerns. A development deal in the Pearl District collapsed during due diligence when the investors' attorneys flagged the regulatory history. Greg Hartwell sold his interest in the firm in the fall following the settlement. at a price considerably less than an unencumbered firm might have fetched. He moved to the Phoenix area. I have no feelings about this beyond mild curiosity. Rachel remained as sole managing partner of the much-reduced firm. Approximately 8 months after the settlement, a former employee filed a wrongful termination complaint, alleging she had been let go for raising internal compliance concerns. The case settled out of court. I know these things not because I tracked them exactly, but because Portland is not as large as it imagines itself to be. I will tell you honestly that I felt no pleasure reading them. What I felt was the mild, impersonal recognition of consequence, the sense that the world has a bookkeeping system that is slow, imperfect, and not reliably satisfying, but that functions. What did I feel, in the end, about the Hartwells? Contempt would be too simple. Contempt lets people off the hook, makes them into cartoons. Rachel Hartwell is not a cartoon. She is a person who chose over and over to take what was not hers and who arranged her entire emotional presentation. The warmth, the rehearsed vulnerability, the January visit in the soft sweater, in service of that taking. She understood people the way a lockpick understands a lock, not out of affection, but as an instrument. That cold instrumentalizing of other people's feeling is the thing I find most unforgivable. More than the money, more than the affair. But I don't spend much time with unforgivable. I've got a garden to tend. The thing I've come to understand about surviving a catastrophic betrayal is that recovery is not a restoration. You do not go back to who you were. The person I was before Daniel died, before the storage unit, before those 7 words in the hospital hallway, is not the person writing this to you. She was happy and trusting, and maybe a little incurious about the foundations of the happiness she was standing on. I'm not her anymore. I'm someone who has read the foundations, load-bearing wall by load-bearing wall, and knows what she's standing on. I think I'm better for it. I know I'm lonelier than I was. I know I'm stronger than I was. I know the difference now between a life I've constructed and a life I've been handed. On a Tuesday evening this past October, I was in my garden deadheading the last roses of the season, and I looked up at the sky. That particular Portland October sky, pewter and gold at the edges. And I thought, I'm okay. Not fine. Not performing fine. Actually okay. It had taken 2 years and 4 months to get there. It was worth it.